and welcome to A Call to Arms, a series of interviews with senior UK military leaders exploring a range of issues relevant to defence. My name is Alexandra Stickings and I'm a research fellow in the military sciences team here at RUSI. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank Airbus for their sponsorship of this series. In this episode, I'll be speaking to Lieutenant General Richard Nugee, who is the Climate Change and Sustainability Strategy Lead for the Ministry of Defence, having been appointed in 2020. Prior to this, Richard was Chief of Defence People, a post he had held since April 2016. Richard, thank you so much for joining me today. Climate change is such an important issue and something that's so relevant at the moment, and I'm really pleased that you're here with me to discuss the topic.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Ali, and I'm really looking forward to the chat because actually this is something that is coming much more to the fore in defence, but also with COP26 in Glasgow at the end of the year, both as a nation and internationally. I think this is going up the agenda all the time.
Absolutely. I was just wondering, actually, before we get into the real meat of the subject, if you could just give us a bit of a background for the Ministry of Defence and climate change. You know, what's been the story so far? What led to your appointment? And what has your work entailed over the last year?
So the Ministry of Defence is not new to ideas of sustainability and the environment. We have a lot of sites of special scientific interest, SSSIs as they're called, across the country, in fact, more than Natural England. And so we've been looking after them for a very long time. But it's predominantly been based on our rural estate, our training areas and things like that. That's where we've pushed most of our environmental effort. We haven't really considered emissions, and the country signed up to, the government signed up to a net zero by 2050 for the whole country, and we weren't really involved in that at all. So my role came about because, broadly speaking, I thought that this was not good enough and I think we needed to do more. So I went to the Permanent Secretary and said, look, I'll do a job for you. I'll write a review of where we are. It coincided with a national audit review, NAO review of defence, and I said what I want to do is try and take this really seriously. What is the effect of climate change on defence? And I will give you a report. It was meant to report in June initially last year, but it rapidly became apparent that actually linking it to COP26 in Glasgow last year would have been a really, really good idea. COP26 was then delayed, of course, because of the pandemic, which gave me a bit more time. But I produced a report on both the effect of climate change on defence, which is how do we operate in a climate changed world, and the effect of defence on climate change, which is what are our emissions and what should we be doing to reduce our emissions. And I produced that for the Defence Board and the Secretary of State by the end of last year. It was very strongly welcomed as a best-in-class report across government in January, and will be published in the next, hopefully, 3 to 4 weeks.
Great. Quite a lot already there to pick out of, and I think I'd like to start with that idea about the emissions, and I guess there's two parts. And I suppose the first part is on the idea of greening defence. You know, we hear about, you know, the basics of energy efficient light bulbs. I think electric tanks is something that you know, you hear come up quite a lot in the discussion. But also interesting, you talked about the relationship between the MOD and broader government. You know, in terms of the UK's broader climate change policies. Just wondering if you could expand on that a bit. How do you see that perhaps changing as we move forward?
So I don't know whether you want me to cover greening and defence first, but let's go there. I'm really clear. When you talk to business and you talk to the sort of the gurus who try and help business, they turn around and say the first thing you should do is look at your purpose. What is your purpose? And so, for example, oil and gas companies have become energy companies. They have re-looked at their purpose, and what do? They don't produce oil and gas; they produce energy. And that gives them a way into greening their whole opportunity, if you like, because what they're doing is really producing energy. That's not relevant to us. We have a really clear purpose, and that purpose is to defend this nation and protect its citizens. That's what we're paid to do by government, and we would be derelict if we didn't put that first every time. So what my report says, and what I'm really keen to do, is to look at the opportunities that a complete revolution in technology of energy, which is what is going on in the next, going on now, but will continue to go on for the next 10 to 15 years, how we would take advantage of this revolution to completely rethink how we use energy. So I'll give you a couple of examples, very, very simple examples. And it's not whether we have an electric tank or not. But if you look at our minesweepers that the Royal Navy uses, at the moment, we put a plastic boat into a minefield with 20 to 30 people on it, putting at risk that plastic boat if they go wrong, and the 20 to 30 people on that boat who would all be killed if a mine went off underneath that ship. Far better. Take, sorry, and it's obviously a diesel-powered engine. Far better, take the people out of the ship. You can then reduce its size extraordinarily because you're not having to size it for a person. You can then have many more for the same price. So you have wider stretch because you can have, let's say, 10 going as opposed to 1. But most importantly, from this perspective, it is a small enough unit that green energy opportunities then become really very available. So instead of a 70-ton tank, as another example, if we can find, by taking the person out of the tank, if we can find an opportunity for perhaps a 25-ton tank or even a 15-ton tank, because you take an awful lot of the weight away if you're not having to put really, really strong protective armor around it because you don't have any people inside it, then it offers the opportunity for green energy to be used. And if you offer the opportunity for green energy to be used, then you reduce your emissions. So we can reduce our emissions very significantly that way. So I see this as an opportunity to think differently. This is not a threat. And I repeatedly say this is not a zero-sum game. This is not either or. It's not either greening or military capability. This is both. Because if you have that minesweeper, let's say, you have 10, you've got much, much wider. And actually, if you had 5 out and 5 recharging at any time from a mothership that, let's say, might be run off nuclear, I don't know. I really don't know what that would be. But if you did that, then you've got 24-hour capability without having to change the crew. You've got much wider spread. That's what I'm after in terms of greening defense. It's that sort of imaginative thinking that we're looking at. In terms of Cross Whitehall, this is really interesting. I was lucky enough, fortunate enough, I would say, to go to Iraq in 2003. I was on the second, if you like, rotation. And I ended up being the city mayor, for want of a better phrase, of a city called Azabaya, just south of Basra, where I had, broadly speaking, 1 million citizens to look after. As a lieutenant colonel, extraordinary experience. But what I learned from that is that the military has to effectively have a microcosm of life. And that is how it is in this country. We have a microcosm of life. We have 440,000 hectares of land, which we have to deal with. We have something in the region, I always get the figure wrong, but something in the region of 100,000 buildings we have to deal with. We have a transport fleet, which is one of the biggest in government. We're the 7th largest provider of houses to our people in terms of a single company. There are many, many ways that we reflect the rest of society as a microcosm. And we need to be able to deal with that and deal with it in the way that is coherent with the rest of government. And that's something that we're working on really closely.
Great. I think building on that, you mentioned COP26, it's such an opportunity, for the international community. And I suppose looking at, on one side, you have the UK MOD within the UK, but then you have the defense sector internationally, within the broader international system. And just wondering your thoughts on what can militaries do? How can the international defense sector, perhaps come together to help push the agenda forward, whether that's on mitigation strategies, on working with other countries, assisting with capabilities? Are there any ways that you think the defense sector can actually have a really positive impact here?
So this is a really rich theme, and I'm really keen to get this into COP26. Haven't achieved it yet, but the fact that the Prime Minister used his presidency of the UN Security Council to talk about climate and security, I think, is really important and something that we need to build on. Climate and security, again, is one of these things that's gone up the agenda astronomically in the last 12 months. It's something I've been pushing really hard for the last year or so. So a number of themes there. The first is greening militaries. If we can get a coherent approach across all militaries to reduce their emissions, then we've done a huge amount. We are, as the Ministry of Defence, some 50% of central government emissions in this country. The Pentagon has, I am told, and it's not a figure I've checked, but I'm told the Pentagon's emissions are the equivalent of Denmark. This is big stuff in almost every country. Why? Because militaries to date have not been very green conscious, or at least have not reduced their emissions very far. And so if you get into every single military in the world, you are doing a significant amount of improvement of emissions. That's the first approach, which is to try and get people to agree that militaries should try and reduce their emissions without reducing their operational capability. And NATO has picked up on that, and it's one of the themes that NATO is going down. So as an alliance for us, that's great. And NATO is absolutely actively looking at how can we reduce emissions. It's really difficult because we have a single fuels policy in NATO, which means that one fuel answers all our prayers. We're not going to be able to have that in the future, or it's very unlikely we're going to be able to have that in the future, because it's a much more complex world if you take away fossil fuels. And therefore, we're going to have to think really carefully about how to do it and how to have interoperability across militaries and military alliances. But that shouldn't stop us with an ambition. The second piece is making sure that we're adapted to a climate changed world, and we can operate in a climate changed world. Now that's more of a sort of we need to make sure that we are optimized for working in a climate changed world, and that means optimized, for example, of things like humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, if that's where we're going to go. So we need to understand that more. But the third piece, and this is the piece which I think is most exciting in many respects, there is little doubt now, I would contend, some still contend it, but I would say there's little doubt that climate change acts as a threat multiplier. That threat, it's not necessarily the catalyst for conflict. And I think it's quite difficult to prove that it is the catalyst for conflict. But there's no doubt that in many cases, and it is logical in its common sense, many cases, that it will exacerbate problems and tensions, whether it is water wars, of which I don't think there are any literal water wars at the moment, but there's no reason why there shouldn't be, such as migration, that if you make the Sahel, as is likely to be if we don't start reducing the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the Sahel is going to be almost unlivable in, as opposed to just very difficult to live in. You're going to get mass migration around the Sahel, potentially. Some people have put the figure at 200 million migrants away from the Sahel because it just becomes too hot to live in. If you go down that route, migration has the potential to lead to conflict. So what can we do about that? Well, the first thing we can do is horizon scan and look for where those potential conflicts might happen. And we've set up with the Alan Turing Institute if you like, a model, a computer model that might show us where the nexus of poor governance, or weak governance, I should say, not poor governance, weak governance, climate change, difficult environmental conditions already come together, which means that is the most likely or the more likely place to have conflict. We can horizon scan, so we can point our laser focus, if you like, on those sorts of areas and understand what's going on. We can reduce conflict. This is a debatable point, but we can reduce conflict because actually a nation or a state that is in conflict, it's a double whammy against the climate. It's a double whammy because at the moment, militaries are emitters, and the more you go to war, the more you emit. It's as simple as that. That's one whammy. The second whammy, if you like, the double whammy, is that actually, if you're thinking about conflict, the last thing you're thinking about is trying to reduce your emissions. What you're actually thinking about is how to win that conflict. And therefore, you're taking away from an opportunity to reduce emissions and you're increasing emissions. So what can we do to reduce conflict? It is as simple as that actually, if we as the militaries of the world understood that, we could start to try and understand how to reduce conflict. The next bit is actually building resilience. And I think there's a role here. This is much more controversial and much more difficult to achieve, but actually, why wouldn't we look to build resilience in those areas where we think there is either weak governance or a greater propensity to suffering from climate change? And I think how you build that resilience is really, really important, but it's really sensitive. And I don't have any solutions to that. The last thing we want to be is Western powers coming in to tell you how to do business. That would be the worst possible thing that we could do. But actually, there must be a way that we can use our soft power to build resilience. Finally, and I don't think we're there yet, but there was an interesting article in America about a year ago, whose title was, "Should we invade Brazil to save the Amazon rainforest?" In other words, using military hard power for environmental reasons. Now, that's the great fear of the environmentalists, that we securitize the environmental movement and it all becomes about hard power and weapons. We're not there. We may never get there. But actually, in 10 years, 15, 20 years' time, if we're really desperate, people may think differently. But I'm not prepared to sort of go down that route at the moment. We should be using military soft power. There is a whole network of attaches. Frankly, if we're not fighting somebody, we're usually their friends. I used to say, as Chief of Defence people, I have more in common with my Australian opposite number than I do with a fellow Director General in the Home Office. We think alike, militaries. We ought to use that.
I mean, you've covered a huge amount, and I think it does just bring home how complex this topic is and how many different aspects. Really interesting. Talking about that idea of the potential of invading countries and the fact that conflict itself has such impacts on the environment, and therefore what responsibility to bring climate considerations into the other aspects. And it's moving from, I guess, that idea of the securitization of climate change, which it's a concern, but also then that, I guess, they're calling it the climatization of security, where climate considerations are brought into all of those considerations, and that balance that will have to be met as we move forward.
And I would, Ali, I would say something else here, which is that I think it is naive, and I'm going to use that word. I think it is naive if we believe that climate change and security do not have any form of relationship. If climate change goes really badly wrong, if we don't address the 3 to 4%, 3 to 4 degree increase that we seem to be on a projection of at the moment, even 1.5% is going to make this world more difficult to live in than we have today. We've already built in the climate change of 2030, and some would say we're already past half the tipping points that will get us to a really unpleasant world. But humans being humans, the net effect of that is likely, or is at least got a chance of being, a security and a conflict response. And therefore, if we don't understand that, then we're denying the fact that climate and security have a direct link. Similarly, conflict creates climate emissions. And therefore, again, if we ignore the relevance of security in the climate change debate, we're ignoring some of the problem, which is that those, as I said earlier, those states in conflict create greater emissions. So we can't afford to ignore it. And this is my point really to COP26, and my comment to those who would see it as just securitization of the climate debate. They're inextricably linked, whether we like it or not. We can't get away from that fact, and therefore what we must do is understand it and embrace the concept and then do something about it, rather than saying, I'll put the hand up to, I don't want anything to do with security in the climate debate.
So there's a huge amount, obviously, of outreach as well then for militaries and and the defense sector as well, with those other aspects of the climate debate, and trying to find the common ground, and trying to ensure that we can all work together. I suppose I just, thinking, just to finish up, this is a long-term issue. We know that, and we don't know what it's going to look like in 10, 20 years. Are we there yet with invading other countries? We don't know, but we may be there. And so, for those people joining the military now, who are earlier in their careers, who will be dealing with this, further down the road, whether it's their area of specialization or not, they need to engage with this. What advice do you have to them in how best to engage, how to ensure that they're prepared in the future to be able to do their jobs within this constantly changing environment?
Well, I'm not sure I'm in a place to offer advice, but I would go back to it. It became a phrase that was discredited at the turn of the century, that we used to call ourselves a force for good, and then Iraq and Afghanistan got in the way, and it was seen as a discredited phrase. But I think it is a similar sentiment that we're trying to get to at the moment, which is a force for good. And let me explain that. I have said to defence, and I would say to any defence force in the world, if we don't deal with it today, we won't be able to deal with it tomorrow. In other words, we've got to get on with reducing our emissions, not at the expense of operational capability. And I really want to make that clear, but where we possibly can and we should. And I believe that most militaries will be in a similar situation to us, not the same, but a similar situation to us, where they have a degree of land because they need land for their troops to train over, their armies to train over particularly. And you can use that land to sequester carbon. And therefore that sequester of carbon can offset, and I'm not talking about buying offsets on the market, I'm talking about can balance, if you like, the irreducible minimum come 2050, the irreducible minimum of fossil fuels that we're still using. As I believe we will still be creating emissions one way or another in 2050. We just have to get it down to an absolute minimum. So militaries should get it down to an absolute minimum. And my if you like, my advice to somebody joining the military is become part of the solution, not part of the problem, and therefore try and help us become more emission conscious and reduce our emissions. As far as climate and security is concerned, I would argue that we are in a blessed position. We are, despite COVID and despite everything else, we're still a very wealthy country. We still put a lot of effort into our military, and we're very proud of our military. What we should therefore be doing, in my mind, is using that military for the benefit of not only the protection of our citizens and defense of the nation, but also for the benefit of the world in terms of encouraging others to go down the same route. And that, I think, is a really fantastic opportunity for people joining in the future, that actually we could be not only saving our own country emissions, but helping others do the same.
That's great. I mean, thank you for bringing a sense of optimism to I think what is often a very pessimistic debate when we talk about emissions and the world warming and everything changing and conflict and it's good to see that there is something that we can take from all of this and actually try and have a positive impact. You covered so much in what's a relatively short period of time, which again just shows how complex the issue is. But obviously, I think it's very positive to have you in the role and to bring a sense of coherence and momentum to the MOD in how it's approaching this issue. Thank you so much again for joining me today. It's been fantastic to hear from you.
Pleasure, absolute pleasure.
Well, I hope everyone enjoyed this episode of A Call to Arms. Please do keep an eye out on RUSI website and RUSI social media for future episodes, and do also sign up to the Military Sciences mailing list. I'd also like to take this opportunity again to thank our sponsors, Airbus, for allowing us to do this series. Thank you.